Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to try to get insight, well, really understand Hamas.
Yeah,
You hear that name all the time,
sure.
but it feels like, I don't know, it's always kind of a mystery. So we're going way beyond the headlines, like we always do, and really getting into it.
Right.
And to guide our deep dive today, we are using the Wikipedia article on Hamas, which is really, really in-depth.
Yeah, it's a deep one. It's a rabbit hole.
Oh, yeah.
You can really get lost in the weeds.
Definitely. We're going to be unpacking their origins, how they've changed over the years, and trying to like really get a sense of how they actually function, not just, the headlines.
Yeah, and it's amazing how a group can be so much in the spotlight,
Right.
and yet still so poorly understood. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think to really get Hamas, you have to dig into, the history, the ideology that shaped them.
So, like, where did this group even come from? What were they like in the very beginning?
Well, you got to go back, to understand Hamas. We have to go back to the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza in the 1950s.
Okay.
And this wasn't, the militant organization that we know today.
Right.
Back then, they were mainly focused on things like, social services and religious training.
Interesting. Okay, so that's a far cry from, like, the image we always see in the news. So when did that shift to militancy, when did that start to happen?
It was gradual, for sure. It really gained momentum, though, during the first Intifada, which started in 1987. And that was a real, period of intense uprising against the Israeli occupation.
Right.
And that was a turning point for Hamas.
Yeah, that makes sense. So as tensions were really rising, they kind of took on a more active role.
Yes.
And a more militant role.
And this is where it gets really wild.
Okay.
Early on, in a really interesting twist, Israel actually saw Hamas as kind of a way to counterbalance the PLO, who they saw as, at the time, the bigger threat.
Wait, so hold on. Israel supported Hamas.
It's
unimaginable now.
It seems counterintuitive now, but at the time, they thought, a religiously oriented group like Hamas would be less of a challenge to their authority. And then they even gave them a little bit of, quiet support.
Wow. Talk about an unexpected turn of events.
Yeah, right.
So how did Hamas evolve from that? Like, what is it they're actually ultimately fighting for?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's where it gets kind of murky.
Okay.
Hamas's stance on Israel and a Palestinian state it's been fluid. It's changed a lot.
Right.
In the beginning, their objective, what they wanted, was a state that included all of what was historically known as mandatory Palestine.
So we're talking the whole region.
The whole shebang.
From the Jordan River.
From the Jordan River.
And the Mediterranean.
The Mediterranean. That's what they wanted. However, between 2005 and 2007, there were signs that maybe they would think about accepting a state just within the 1967 borders and maybe even agreeing to a long-term truce.
But those 67 borders, that's a huge sticking point in this whole thing, right?
Yeah, for sure. The 67 borders, they basically show the areas that Israel occupied after the Six-Day War.
Right.
And that includes the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem.
Right.
So that's the line in the sand, as it were.
That helps to clarify it. So what happened with Hamas and their stance on those borders?
So get this. In 2017, they released a new charter.
Okay.
It kind of surprised some people. And in it, they again said they were okay with a Palestinian state in those 67 borders. But, and this is key, they still wouldn't say outright that they'd recognize Israel's right to actually exist.
Okay. And just to make things even less clear, haven't we seen different Hamas leaders say totally different things about what their, long-term goals actually are?
Yeah, it's true. It's confusing.
There's a real debate, even among, people who study this stuff for a living, about whether Hamas is really open to a two-state solution, where you have an independent Palestinian state existing peacefully next to Israel. Or if they were still holding on to the idea of one single Islamic state over all of historic Palestine.
Right. So their ultimate goal might not be that different from what some Zionist groups were originally after, which was basically, full control.
Exactly. And you've hit on a comparison that a lot of scholars make.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how incredibly thorny and complicated this conflict really is. It's not a simple, good guys, bad guys scenario.
Right.
It's this tangled web of, overlapping claims and historical baggage and changing ideologies.
Okay, so we've gotten into their history.
We've kind of unpacked their ideology, at least as best we can. But I'm curious about Hamas as an organization. Like, how do they actually work?
Well, think of it as having three different parts. They've got one branch focused on social services, another one doing religious training, and of course you've got their military wing. And then kind of overseeing everything is their Shura Council, which basically acts as their leadership.
That's that's a sophisticated setup.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider all the pressure they're under.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, exactly why they've been so good at, not just surviving, but thriving under pressure. They're able to function even with, people looking over their shoulder constantly and military actions targeting them directly.
And speaking of military actions,
Mm-hmm.
How do they pay for all this? Like, how is Hamas funded? Because it's got to be expensive, right?
It's hugely expensive. And their funding sources, it's actually kind of interesting how it's evolved over the years. They used to really rely on donations, especially from, rich individuals and groups in the Gulf states that liked what they were doing.
So basically wealthy benefactors, kind of.
Yeah, pretty much. But then things changed big time after they won the election, kind of unexpectedly back in 2006.
Right.
They started getting more serious support from actual countries, state sponsors, most notably Iran, and for a while there, Syria.
But I bet those relationships, they've been a little bit, bumpy.
Oh, yeah.
Given how, up and down things are in that region.
Definitely. And a perfect example is the Arab Spring.
Right.
That really threw a wrench in their relationship with Syria. Hamas decided to side with the Syrian opposition, which, as you can imagine, did not go over well with the Assad regime. And, of course, they're tight with Iran.
Right.
So it put them in a really tough spot.
Yeah. They had to choose between, their ideology and these alliances that were really keeping them afloat.
Totally. It's like, who do you side with? Your friends or, what you believe in. And it shows how complicated their situation is.
Yeah.
They can't really afford to lose the support of these powerful allies, but they also can't just abandon, what they claim to stand for, their long-term goals.
It's a real tightrope walk, with all these geopolitical tensions.
Absolutely.
Every move has to be so calculated.
It's like they're playing, 3D chess on a waterbed.
Right.
It's just constantly shifting,
And they have to stay 10 steps ahead just to survive.
At least. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about their military operations, their funding. But there's this whole other part of Hamas that I always found really fascinating, and that's their commitment to social services.
Yeah.
Like, they have this huge network, and it seems like a really important part of their strategy. What's that all about?
It's absolutely crucial. To really get it, we got to go back to that idea of dawah, which, in Arabic basically means the call to God.
Right, yeah. You mentioned that earlier, talking about the Muslim Brotherhood and their kind of early focus on religious education and stuff like that.
That idea is at the core of their whole social services network. It's about being present in the community, providing help where it's needed, and building that foundation of support among Palestinians.
So it's about more than just like putting a Band-Aid on the problem.
Yeah.
It's a way to build legitimacy.
For sure.
To gain influence within Palestinian society.
They've been really good at stepping in where the Palestinian Authority hasn't, particularly in Gaza, where, the humanitarian situation is just awful.
Right.
It's really bad.
So they're stepping in, they're providing these vital services that people need.
Which builds trust.
That other people haven't.
Totally.
And by doing so, they're gaining the trust and loyalty of the people they say they represent.
It's smart, especially in a region where you have so much poverty, unemployment. People just need basic stuff.
Yeah.
And Hamas is there.
And so we're starting to see, more to Hamas than just, this image of a purely militant group. There's social services, there's the religious outreach, they're making political moves. But what about their military wing? I think that's what most people think of when they hear the name Hamas.
Yeah, absolutely. The Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, that's what they call their military wing.
Okay.
And they're known for, they've got, you name it, they got rockets, they've got IEDs, even this crazy network of tunnels under Gaza.
Tunnels, now what are those used for?
Oh, man, they can use them for all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Sneaking weapons and supplies into Gaza, launching these surprise attacks on Israeli forces. They can even be used for, like, communication and getting around within Gaza.
Wow.
It's wild.
So it's giving them a tactical advantage in a fight where, they're clearly outmatched.
For sure.
If it were a conventional war.
Yeah, if they had to fight, out in the open, they'd be toast.
Right.
But this levels the playing field a little bit.
So what's the official line from Hamas? Do they claim responsibility for attacks? Or do they have like a specific enemy they're targeting?
Officially, they say they only go after military targets within Israel and Palestine. But in reality, it's more complicated than that. There have definitely been attacks on Israeli civilians.
You're right.
And those are, obviously awful, tragic situations.
And what about this whole thing with human shields? We hear that a lot.
Yeah.
Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, it's a tactic that's been used, putting civilians in harm's way to, maybe make Israel think twice about attacking. And it's disturbing, honestly, and it just shows how devastating this conflict is. It's just awful for everyone involved.
And it makes it hard to know, what to believe, especially in a war zone.
Yeah, and it's really hard to investigate and be sure about these claims when you're in the middle of an active war zone.
Right.
It's just a sensitive, very ethical issue.
Okay, so wow. We've looked at their beginnings, their ideology, their internal structure, how they get funding, their social service programs, and their military power. What about, like, globally? How's Hamas viewed on the world stage?
Well, it's a mixed bag, for sure.
Okay.
A lot of Western countries, the U.S., the U.K., Canada, they all say Hamas is a terrorist organization.
But I'm guessing in other parts of the world, especially in Muslim-majority countries, they're seen a bit more sympathetically.
You're exactly right.
All right.
There's a huge gap in how people see Hamas around the world. For a lot of people in the Muslim world, they're freedom fighters, standing up to what they see as an occupying power,
right,
fighting for the Palestinian people.
Which is why, that UN motion to condemn them back in 2018, it didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
The fact that they even considered it just shows how divided the world is on this.
It really does. It's a perfect example of how differently Hamas is seen.
So, depending on, I guess, who you ask, they're either freedom fighters or they're terrorists. And it seems like there's not a lot of middle ground.
That's the crux of it. And it really reflects how complicated the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is as a whole. There's no easy answers here.
Right.
No simple solutions. It's just this long, sad story of pain and mistrust and violence.
Well, it's clear. We're only just beginning to even scratch the surface of this group.
Oh yeah.
They're fascinating.
Oh yeah, fascinating.
And really complex. We're going to be back in just a minute to dig deeper into Hamas's relationships with the major players in the region.
Good.
And figure out how those alliances are shaping how they act on the world stage.
Oh, right.
Okay, so we're back and ready to kind of, unpack this really complicated web of alliances and rivalries that we see with Hamas. It's a delicate balancing act.
Totally, yeah. It really is. Imagine, like, being surrounded by all these powerful neighbors, all of them with their own interests, and you're stuck in the middle trying to just kind of maintain your own, independence and influence. That's what Hamas is dealing with every single day.
Yeah, and it seems like you can't really understand their strategy without first understanding those relationships.
You can't look at them in a vacuum, that's for sure.
So let's start with Iran. That's got to be their biggest backer, right?
For sure. They've been the most reliable source of both money and military support for Hamas, going back quite a ways.
And that relationship, it's, I'm guessing, rooted in their shared opposition to Israel?
Exactly. Iran has always seen itself as, like a protector of the Palestinian cause.
Right.
And for them, supporting Hamas is a way to push back against what they see as Israeli aggression in the region.
Okay, but haven't there been some bumps in the road there too?
Yeah.
Especially during the Syrian civil war.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I vaguely remember that being a point of tension.
Yeah, that was a real test for them. Hamas refused to back Assad in Syria, which, as you know, is a major ally of Iran.
Right.
So that put them at odds, big time.
Yeah. So once again, they're in this tough position where they have to choose between, I guess, loyalty to a key ally and their own, I don't know,
Well,
principle.
values, yeah.
Even if it means potentially, making an enemy
Right.
of someone really powerful.
Absolutely, and it really shows just how difficult, how tenuous all this is. And to be honest, it's pretty amazing that they've managed to, I don't know, patch things up as much as they have in the last few years.
So it's a relationship based on, this kind of shared set of goals, but also tested by these constant regional conflicts.
Totally.
But somehow they're still going. It's really, I don't know what the right word is.
It's a testament to something. I don't know if it's, shared values or just the nature of that part of the world, I guess. Right.
Right. So that's Iran. What about Qatar? They've been pretty important for Hamas too, right?
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I mean, they've been a lifeline, really, providing financial help when Hamas has desperately needed it.
And haven't they also been more, I guess, diplomatic?
For sure.
Like stepping in to try to, I don't know, negotiate between Hamas and Israel, especially when things are really heated.
Yeah, they're like the cool head in the room trying to find some kind of, common ground and prevent things from boiling over completely.
Wow.
It's a tough job, but someone's got to do it.
So they're playing this role of like the mediator, the peace broker, trying to keep everyone talking and stop things from escalating into, a full-blown war.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They've been involved in, like, setting up ceasefires, getting aid into Gaza when it's really needed, stuff like that.
It's amazing how they've kind of carved out this role for themselves in the region.
It is, isn't it?
Being this really important go-between.
Well, they have a knack for it. It takes a real understanding of how things work over there to navigate all these relationships.
Absolutely.
Like, make it work.
Okay, so we've got Iran, Qatar, any other major players?
Oh, yeah. Can't forget about Turkey.
Right. Turkey, I mean, especially with Erdogan in charge, they've become way more vocal in their support for Palestine in general.
Totally. Under Erdogan, they've really become a strong voice for the Palestinian cause.
Okay.
He's called out Israel a bunch of times over their treatment of the Palestinians. And he's put his money where his mouth is, too. They've given Hamas, political support, but also, actual resources.
I bet that's caused some, I don't know, some friction with some of these Western countries who have labeled Hamas, a terrorist organization.
Yeah, totally. It's definitely created some tension, especially with the U.S.
Okay.
But, on the flip side, it also shows that Turkey's trying to, like, position themselves as a leader in the Muslim world.
Right.
They're the ones sticking up for the Palestinians.
So it's a strategic move.
Yeah.
Build some influence in the region.
Oh, yeah.
Appeal to Muslims around the world.
Yeah, it's a power play, for sure. They want to be a major player on the world stage. And they want to shake things up. They don't want things to stay the way they've always been.
Interesting. Very interesting. So we talked Iran, Qatar, Turkey. Egypt's got to be a big one too, right? I mean, they share an actual border with Gaza.
Yeah, no, Egypt is huge. And their relationship with Hamas, man, talk about complicated. I mean, it's been up, it's been down.
Right.
There have been times when they were practically BFFs.
Right.
And then, other times when they couldn't stand each other.
Didn't they used to be a lot closer back when Morsi, from the Muslim Brotherhood was in charge of Egypt?
Exactly. When Morsi was in power, they had that kind of Muslim Brotherhood bond.
Right.
The border between Egypt and Gaza, that Rafah crossing, it was way more open back then.
Okay.
People and goods could flow a lot easier.
Okay.
There was a sense that, they were in it together. But then, of course, when Morsi got kicked out.
Right. Things changed pretty drastically then, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. Big time. The current government, with Sisi in charge, they see Hamas as a threat.
Okay.
A security threat. They've even said that Hamas has been helping these militant groups that are causing trouble inside Egypt.
So, wow. A complete 180 from working together to basically accusing each other of pretty serious stuff and shutting down the borders.
It's been a wild ride, that's for sure. One minute you're buddies, the next minute you're pointing fingers and, shutting down that Rafah crossing. It's made things even tougher on the people living in Gaza.
Yeah. I mean, talk about pressure. Hamas has to navigate all these relationships, all of them constantly changing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know. It's like they're playing this high stakes game.
Yeah.
And the stakes are, their survival, the stability of the whole region.
It's a lot of pressure, that's for sure. One wrong move, one miscalculation could have huge consequences.
Okay. So that's how Hamas operates on the world stage.
Right.
But what about closer to home, what about their control within Gaza itself?
Yeah.
How do they govern, especially under a blockade?
Well, that's a great question, and we often focus on those big international things, but their internal control, their internal security
Right.
is just as important. I mean, they've had to become experts at it.
Because it's not just external threats they're dealing with. It's also like keeping a lid on any potential dissent or challenges from within Gaza itself.
Think about it, you're governing a population that's been through decades of war, poverty, blockades. It's a recipe for unrest. So keeping things under control is absolutely vital for them.
Okay, so how do they do that? Like what are the specific tactics they use to, I guess, maintain that internal control?
Well, they've got a whole internal security force,
right,
whose job is to keep an eye on things within Gaza.
Okay.
They watch people, they try to spot any potential threats, and, if they have to, they crack down on anyone who's speaking out against them.
Right, and we've talked about how they enforce Islamic law in Gaza, and I imagine that plays a part in this too, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it does come from their ideology, but it's also a way to control how people act.
Right.
When you set really clear limits on individual freedom, it tends to make people think twice about, rocking the boat.
Right. So it's a way to exert control, not through, force or fear necessarily, but by kind of shaping like the fabric of society itself.
Exactly. You said it better than I could have.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, it's worth pointing out that, this approach, it's been criticized by a lot of human rights groups.
Of course.
They say it's stifling dissent.
Right.
And limiting people's freedom.
Totally. And they'd be right. It's a really tricky issue. On one hand, you've got Hamas. They're governing this place, this population, under unimaginable pressure, facing threats all the time.
Right.
On the other hand, some of their methods, well, they definitely make you question how committed they really are to things like human rights and freedom of speech.
Yeah.
It's a balancing act, no doubt about it. It really highlights how tough it is to govern under those circumstances.
For sure. So we've looked at their alliances, their internal security measures. What about their image? How does Hamas present itself to the world?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Like how they use, symbols and how they talk to people to try to create the specific image and connect with, their base.
Like their emblem, for example.
Yeah.
I always think of the one with the mosque and the crossed swords. Like what's the story behind that?
Oh man, it's loaded with symbolism.
Yeah.
I mean, the mosque you see, that's the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which is hugely important religiously to both Muslims and Jews.
Right.
It represents their claim to all of historic Palestine.
Oh, okay.
It's a reminder.
So it's a very visual reminder of their ultimate goal.
Totally, a very powerful visual statement. And then you've got the cross swords, which, let's be real, that's a pretty clear symbol of, their commitment to armed struggle.
It's not subtle.
No, not at all. But, it's a way for them to project strength to their own people.
Right.
But also to anyone else out there who might support their cause.
Yeah, it says we're not backing down.
Exactly. And it's not just those old school symbols either. They're all over social media.
Of course.
They've become pros at using places like Twitter, Facebook, Telegram to get their message out.
It's smart. I mean, it's the best way to control your own narrative.
Absolutely. I mean, they bypass all the usual media,
Yeah.
which they see as biased against them.
Right, the Western media.
Exactly.
That they feel often misrepresents them.
Yeah, so they go directly to the people. They frame things the way they want them to be seen. They can get information out quickly.
Right.
And it's great for fundraising and even recruitment.
It's free advertising, essentially.
Basically, yeah. Although, not everyone's thrilled about it.
Right, because it does come with some downsides.
Of course.
I mean, we've seen concerns about them spreading, false information or inciting violence.
Yeah, there have even been cases where social media companies have actually shut down some of their accounts.
Right.
For that very reason.
Yeah.
Which, just goes to show that social media, it's a powerful tool.
Oh, yeah.
But it can be used for good or for bad.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's all about, the intent of the person using it.
100%. And just highlights again how complex this all is, right? You've got a group like Hamas that's using these really old symbols.
Yeah.
But they're also on the cutting edge of communication to achieve their goals.
It's a fascinating mix. So it's clear that Hamas has figured out how to adapt, how to use whatever tools are available to spread their message.
For sure.
And to grow their support base.
Yeah.
We're going to be back in just a second to kind of, I guess, unpack even more about this group.
Okay.
We'll look at how they use violence,
Right.
what the future might hold for them, all that good stuff.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're back for our final deep dive into this really complex organization that is Hamas. And I feel like after our conversation so far, it's even more clear just how much, misinformation and oversimplification there is out there.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the headlines,
Right.
But to really understand, you got to go deeper.
Exactly. And we've covered a lot of ground, but I think we need to address the elephant in the room, which is Hamas's use of violence. It's a really sensitive
Oh, yeah.
and often, really controversial topic.
For sure. And it's one of those things you really got to approach carefully, recognizing the history, the context, the fact that there's been so much suffering on both sides.
Absolutely. It is really hard to talk about their use of violence without, acknowledging that.
You can't. You can't separate it.
And of course, their 1988 charter, the one where they basically said they wanted to destroy Israel, that's been a huge sticking point for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, that's the document that everyone points to, as proof that they're not really interested in peace.
Right. Right.
But here's the thing. That charter was written over 35 years ago.
Right. Back when they first formed.
The world was a very different place. And the situation, even within the conflict itself, was different. It was written, right in the middle of the first Intifada.
Right, when things were particularly intense.
Exactly. So, it's a product of its time, in a way.
And there's been a lot of debate over whether or not that charter is even, relevant today.
Oh, tons.
Like, is that still their official stance?
Right. Some people say it's been replaced by, what they're saying and doing now.
Right.
Other people say it's still their North Star,
Right.
It's part of what makes them so hard to figure out.
It's all very, very murky. So, given all of that, how does Hamas justify their use of violence,
Yeah.
especially, when you have civilian casualties?
Well, they see it as, a legitimate form of resistance. To them, they're fighting a war against an occupying force, fighting for their freedom, for self-determination.
So in their minds, they're in this fight for survival against, let's be honest, a much, much stronger adversary.
Exactly. And they look at what's happening, the settlements, the restrictions on Palestinians.
The blockade.
All of it. To them, that's aggression. And, they feel like they have to respond.
But, a lot of their methods, especially the ones that have led to civilian deaths, have been condemned internationally.
And rightfully so. Look, you can't condone attacks on civilians. That's just wrong. But you also can't ignore how unbelievably complicated things are in Gaza.
Because it's so densely populated.
Exactly.
And it's almost impossible to, separate out civilians from fighters.
It's a nightmare scenario. And it makes those accidental civilian casualties, which are horrible, much more likely.
Right. So it's tragic, but it's also this cycle that just feeds itself.
It's awful.
Because then, both sides feel justified.
And it makes it almost impossible to imagine how you even begin to untangle all that.
Absolutely. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, where do you think Hamas goes from here? What does the future hold for this group?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And to be honest, if I could predict the future, I wouldn't be here.
Yeah, fair enough.
But seriously, there's so much in play right now. You got the regional stuff, what's happening within both Israeli and Palestinian societies, what's going on globally. It's just impossible to say for sure.
And it's not like Hamas is, this perfectly unified group.
Oh, no way.
They've got their own internal divisions.
Right, totally.
Different ideas about how to move forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are they going to stick with this, this two-pronged approach, the armed resistance and the political engagement?
Right.
Are they going to double down on the social services, really cement their role as, the government in Gaza?
Will they be forced to pick a lane?
Maybe. Or maybe something will happen that we haven't even thought of.
That's probably the most likely scenario.
Probably, yeah. But one thing I do know is Hamas is not going anywhere.
Yeah.
They're major players.
For sure.
And they'll continue to be a force
Right.
in the Middle East.
Well, it's clear that we could spend, hours and hours talking about Hamas.
Oh, easy.
But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this deep dive, it's that, you can't put them in a box.
Nope.
They're complicated.
Totally. And if you don't understand that, if you try to boil them down to like a soundbite or a headline, you're never going to understand the conflict. You're never going to find a solution.
It's all about understanding.
Yeah.
And, with understanding comes, hopefully, some path towards peace.
You got it.
So, to our listeners, please keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah.
Keep learning.
Keep digging.
And, let's all try to make the world a slightly less complicated place.
I'm all for that.
All right. That's it for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.